The navigation system screamed warnings that Daniel Reed could not fix. His cargo hauler spun through space like a broken toy, pulled by the gravity of a moon that should not have been there. The star chart showed nothing in this sector, but the forest world below was very real and getting closer by the second. Daniel strapped himself tight into the pilot's seat and prayed to gods he did not believe in. The ship hit atmosphere and began to burn. Metal groaned and panels tore away. He watched his windshield crack in a dozen places as the craft plunged through clouds toward an endless sea of trees. The impact threw him against his restraints hard enough to crack ribs. His left arm snapped with a sound he would hear in nightmares. The world became a violent blur of spinning and crashing and breaking. Then silence. Daniel hung upside down in his harness, breathing hard. Blood ran down his face from a cut above his eye. His arm hung at a wrong angle, and every breath sent pain through his chest. But he was alive that he released the harness and fell onto what used to be the ceiling. The emergency kit had stayed locked in its compartment. He pulled it free with his good hand and stumbled out through a hole torn in the hull. The forest around him was impossible. Trees rose like towers, their trunks wider than his entire ship. Ferns the size of houses grew in the shadows between them. The air smelled green and wet and alien. Somewhere in the distance, something roared. Daniel needed water and shelter. His ship was dying, systems failing one by one. He grabbed what supplies he could carry and picked a direction that looked slightly less terrifying than the others. He walked for an hour before the trees opened into a clearing. What he saw there made him stop and stare. The nest was massive, woven from branches as thick as his leg and studded with stones that glittered in the filtered sunlight. Inside the nest sat 3 eggs, each one nearly twice his height. They had shells that looked like polished metal, gleaming with colors that shifted when he moved. Daniel knew he should leave. Nothing good lived in a nest that size. But his legs would not move, and his scientific curiosity fought with his common sense. He had never seen anything like this point. One of the eggs moved. Cracks spread across its surface like lightning frozen in metal. Pieces fell away. Something pushed from inside, making sounds that were half chirp and half growl. A head emerged. Then shoulders. Then wings that unfolded wet and crumpled. The creature that climbed free from the broken shell was covered in scales that shimmered blue and green like oil on water. It was already the size of a large horse, with claws that could tear through steel and teeth like daggers. A dragon. Daniel was looking at a newborn dragon. The hatchling shook itself, and pieces of shell flew in all directions. It opened eyes that were bright gold and intelligent. Those eyes found Daniel and locked onto him. The dragon chirped. It was a sound too gentle for something so dangerous. The hatchling took one wobbly step toward him, then another. Its legs were not quite steady yet, but it kept coming. Daniel backed away slowly. The dragon followed. He took another step back. The dragon matched it with 2 steps forward. It made that chirping sound again, softer now, almost questioning. Daniel noticed the other 2 eggs were dark and still. Something had gone wrong with them. This hatchling was alone in the world, barely minutes old, and it had chosen Daniel as the first thing to follow. The ground shook. The mother dragon landed at the edge of the clearing with enough force to crack stone. She was enormous beyond reason, easily 200 feet from nose to tail. Her wings blocked out the sun and cast shadows that swallowed everything. Scales like armor plates covered her body, and her eyes blazed with fire that was not metaphorical. She saw Daniel near a nest. She saw her newborn offspring near this strange small creature. Her roar shook the trees and sent birds screaming into the sky. Daniel knew he was dead. Nothing survived a dragon's anger. He had read the reports, seen the footage. Dragons were classified as extremely dangerous, and contact was forbidden for good reason. The mother dragon opened her jaws and fire gathered at her throat. The hatchling moved between them. The small dragon placed itself directly between Daniel and its mother. It spread its tiny wings and made sounds Daniel had never heard before. Distress sounds, protective sounds. The mother dragon stopped. Fire died in her throat. She tilted her massive head and made a rumbling noise that might have been confusion. She called to her offspring. The sound was deep and commanding and ancient. It said, "Come here," in a language older than words. The hatchling looked back at Daniel. Then it looked at its mother. Then it pressed itself against Daniel's legs and refused to move. The mother dragon tried again. She lowered her head and made gentler sounds. She extended one massive claw in invitation. The hatchling wrapped itself around Daniel's feet and chirped defiantly. Daniel stood very still and tried to understand what was happening. The dragon had just been born. It knew nothing about the world. It should instinctively go to its mother, to safety and food and protection. Instead, it had chosen him. The mother dragon settled onto her haunches at the edge of the clearing. She folded her wings and watched. Her eyes never left Daniel. She did not attack, but she did not leave. She was waiting. The hatchling made a happy sound and rested its head against Daniel's chest. The dragon's scales were warm and smooth under his good hand. Daniel looked at the mother dragon. She looked back. An understanding passed between them that needed no words. This was going to be complicated. Hours passed while the three of them stayed frozen in their strange tableau. The mother dragon, whom Daniel started thinking of as grandmother because she looked ancient despite her power, circled the clearing repeatedly. She would walk the perimeter, pause to call her offspring, then continue when the hatchling refused to respond. Daniel tried to move away from the nest. His arm throbbed and his ribs ached, and he needed to find water soon. He took one careful step backward. The hatchling followed immediately, matching his movement perfectly. He took another step. The dragon followed again, making anxious chirping sounds until it could press against his legs. Once more, grandmother's rumble shook through the ground. She did not like this game. Daniel gave up trying to leave and sat down heavily on a fallen log. The hatchling immediately curled around his feet like an oversized cat. It rested its chin on his knee and looked up at him with those golden eyes. He was trapped by a baby dragon. The absurdity of it almost made him laugh, but laughing hurt his ribs too much. The hatchling started making new sounds. Hungry sounds. Its stomach rumbled loud enough for Daniel to hear clearly. The dragon looked at him expectantly, as if he might produce food from nowhere. Daniel had emergency ration bars in his kit. He pulled one out with his good hand and unwrapped it. The hatchling sniffed the bar with interest, then opened its mouth. Daniel held out the ration bar. The dragon took one bite and immediately spat it out with a sound of pure disgust. It shook its head violently and scraped its tongue against the ground like it had tasted poison. Grandmother apparently heard or sensed her offspring's distress because she launched into the air with one powerful thrust of her wings. The wind from her takeoff nearly knocked Daniel over. She returned less than an hour later, carrying something dead in her claws. The creature she dropped near the nest was massive, built like a bear, but with 6 legs and tusks that curved like swords. She had killed it cleanly with one bite to the neck. Grandmother backed away to the far edge of the clearing and settled down to watch. The hatchling immediately ran to the kill. It tore into the flesh with enthusiasm, making happy growling sounds as it ate. Blood covered its snout and chest. It was messy and violent and completely natural. Daniel watched because there was nothing else to do. Grandmother watched him watching her offspring. He realized what was happening. She was feeding her baby, but she could not get close because the hatchling would not leave Daniel. He had become the anchor point in this bizarre triangle. After eating its fill, the hatchling returned to Daniel. It tried to nuzzle against him with a blood-covered face. Daniel leaned back quickly. The dragon made a confused sound. Then it noticed the blood on itself. It walked to a puddle of rainwater near the nest and dunked its entire head in, washing itself with surprising care. It came back to Daniel clean and sat down next to him, leaning its weight against his side. Daniel carefully put his good arm around the dragon's neck. The scales were warm and smooth. The hatchling made a deep rumbling sound that might have been a purr. Night came fast on the forest moon. The temperature dropped quickly, and Daniel started to shiver in his thin flight suit. His crash had destroyed most of his survival gear. He had no way to make fire, and the cold was seeping into his bones. The hatchling noticed. Dragons apparently saw very well in the dark because it lifted its head and looked at Daniel with concern. It made a questioning sound. Daniel wrapped his arms around himself and shivered harder. His breath came out in clouds of mist. The dragon stood and moved closer. It carefully wrapped one wing around Daniel like a blanket. The heat from the dragon's body was incredible, like standing next to a furnace that did not burn. The wing blocked the wind and trapped warmth against Daniel's body. For the first time since the crash, Daniel felt warm. He leaned against the dragon's side and closed his eyes. The hatchling adjusted its position slightly to make him more comfortable. Daniel slept. He woke to sunlight filtering through the massive trees. The hatchling was still wrapped around him, snoring softly. Grandmother had moved during the night. She was now only 50 feet away instead of at the far edge of the clearing. She was watching him with eyes that had seen centuries. Daniel met her gaze, and neither of them looked away. He understood something in that moment. Grandmother was testing him. She was waiting to see what kind of creature would care for her offspring. Every action he took was being judged by ancient standards he did not fully understand. The hatchling woke and immediately checked on Daniel. It sniffed him carefully, making sure he was unharmed. Then it noticed Grandmother had moved closer. The dragon chirped happily and ran to its mother. Finally, Daniel thought, the spell is broken. Grandmother lowered her massive head and touched her snout to her offspring's nose. She made gentle rumbling sounds. The hatchling responded with chirps and small growls, as if telling its mother everything that had happened. Then the hatchling turned and ran back to Daniel. It sat down next to him and refused to move despite Grandmother's calls. The ancient dragon sighed. It was a sound that somehow conveyed both exasperation and acceptance. She settled down where she was and watched them both. Daniel needed to set his broken arm properly, or it would heal wrong. He found straight pieces of metal from his crashed ship and torn strips of his flight suit. The hatchling watched with intense focus as he struggled one-handed to create a splint. When Daniel gasped in pain while tightening the bindings, the hatchling pressed against him and made soothing sounds. It could not help with the splint, but it stayed close and offered comfort, the only way it knew how to be by the time Daniel finished. He was sweating and shaking from pain. The hatchling very carefully rested its head on his shoulder and hummed a low, vibrating sound that somehow made the pain seem less. Grandmother watched all of this. Then she stood and walked closer. Only 30 feet away now. She laid down and closed her eyes, but Daniel knew she was not sleeping. She was keeping guard. They had formed an agreement without words. Grandmother would provide food and protection. Daniel would stay with her offspring, and the hatchling who had chosen him would keep them all bound together in this strange new family. 6 days passed in the clearing. Daniel fell into a routine that felt both surreal and strangely normal. Grandmother hunted at dawn and dusk, bringing kills that the hatchling devoured eagerly. The young dragon grew visibly each day, adding inches to its height and length. What started as horse-sized was now closer to an elephant. Daniel started calling the hatchling Shadow because it followed him everywhere. When he walked to the stream to drink, Shadow walked beside him. When he worked on salvaging parts from his crashed ship, Shadow watched with focused attention. When he slept, Shadow curled protectively around him. The dragon seemed to like its name. Every time Daniel said Shadow, the hatchling would lift its head and make a pleased chirping sound. Daniel noticed things about Shadow that surprised him. The dragon understood tone better than words. When Daniel spoke gently, Shadow became calm and gentle too. When Daniel laughed at something, Shadow made happy sounds even though it could not understand joke. When pain from his injuries made Daniel gasp or groan, Shadow would immediately stop whatever it was doing and check on him that it was more than instinct. Shadow was learning and thinking and feeling in ways that reminded Daniel of the smartest animals he had ever known, except magnified 100 times on the 7th day. Grandmother brought someone new to the clearing. The second dragon was smaller than Grandmother, perhaps only 100 feet long, with scales that had faded from bright white to cream with age. It moved with careful deliberation, and its eyes held a depth of knowledge that made Daniel think of doctors or teachers. Shadow growled protectively and positioned itself between Daniel and the stranger. Grandmother made a series of sounds that seemed like introduction and explanation. The white dragon listened, then looked at Daniel with clear interest. What happened next shocked Daniel completely. The white dragon's body began to shrink. Bones reformed and scales rearranged themselves. In less than a minute, the dragon had become roughly human-sized, though still clearly reptilian with wings and a tail. Shadow made an odd sound. Apparently, young dragons did not know their kind could do this. The white dragon approached slowly, making calming gestures with clawed hands. Shadow watched carefully, but allowed the approach. The healer, because that was clearly what this dragon was, pointed at Daniel's splinted arm and then at herself. Daniel understood. She was offering to help. He nodded carefully. The healer dragon moved closer, with Shadow watching her every move. She examined the splint with gentle touches, then made a disapproving sound. She gestured for Daniel to remove it. Taking off the splint hurt badly. The healer produced a clay pot from a pouch at her side. Inside was a thick green paste that smelled like earth and growing things. She spread it carefully over Daniel's broken arm while he tried not to yell from the pain. Shadow made distressed sounds throughout the process. The young dragon pushed its nose against Daniel's free hand, offering comfort. The paste began to tingle, then burn, then went numb. The healer worked quickly, manipulating the bone back into proper alignment with expert precision. Daniel bit down on his belt to keep from screaming. Shadow whined and pressed closer. When the healer finished, she wrapped the arm in broad leaves that she pulled from another pouch. Then she sat back and made a satisfied sound. The pain was already less than before. Whatever was in that paste worked better than anything Daniel had in his medical kit. The healer dragon was not finished. She pointed at Shadow, then at Daniel, then touched her own chest over where her heart would be. She repeated the gesture 3 times, making sure Daniel watched carefully. Daniel did not understand. The healer tried again, this time touching Shadow's chest, then Daniel's chest, then bringing her hands together and intertwining her fingers. Shadow. Daniel. Together. Connected. Grandmother approached for the first time since the day of the crash. She moved with careful dignity and stopped just a few feet away. This close, Daniel could see scars on her scales from battles long past. She had lived through things he could not imagine. She lowered her massive head and touched her snout gently to Shadow's face. The young dragon made soft sounds and leaned into its mother's touch. Then Grandmother turned to Daniel. She looked into his eyes for a long moment. Then she bowed her head slightly, just a few degrees, but the meaning was clear. Respect. The healer dragon made sounds that might have been explanation. Grandmother responded with deeper rumbles. They were having a conversation about him, Daniel realized. About Shadow. About what had happened. Shadow sat between them, looking from its mother to the healer to Daniel and back again. The young dragon seemed to sense that something important was being decided. Finally, Grandmother made a sound that carried finality. The healer nodded her head in agreement. Then they both looked at Daniel. The healer pointed at Shadow and made a cradling gesture. Then she pointed at Daniel and made the same gesture. She took a small stone and placed it in Daniel's hand, then wrapped his fingers around it. She would not let him open his hand or release the stone. Responsibility. Daniel understood now. Shadow had bonded to him in some instinctive way that went deeper than choice or chance. This was part of dragon nature, something rare and important. The healer and Grandmother were telling him that Shadow was now his responsibility as much as theirs. The weight of it settled over him like a physical thing. He looked at Shadow, who watched him with complete trust in those golden eyes. The dragon had chosen him when it was seconds old, before it knew anything about the world. It had chosen him and refused to unchoose him despite every reason to stay with its own kind. Daniel set down the stone and placed his hand on Shadow's neck. The dragon hummed with pleasure and leaned into the touch. He thought about his ship, broken beyond any repair he could manage alone. He thought about the beacon that might never work again. He thought about being stranded on an unmapped world with no way home. And he thought about leaving Shadow, about climbing into a rescue ship and flying away while the dragon tried to follow. The image hurt worse than his broken arm ever had. Grandmother watched him work through it. When Daniel looked up at her, He knew she understood what he had decided even before he did. She bowed her head again, deeper this time. The healer dragon shifted back to her full size and took flight. Grandmother settled at the edge of the clearing. Shadow pressed close to Daniel and made the rumbling purr sound that meant contentment. Daniel had been accepted, not as a guest or an intruder, but as part of something bigger than himself. Part of a dragon family. 2 weeks after the crash, Daniel finally got his emergency beacon working. He had salvaged parts from 3 different systems and jury-rigged them together with wire and hope. When the small device flickered to life and began broadcasting, he felt both relief and something else he could not quite name. The response came 6 hours later. A rescue ship had picked up his signal and was changing course to reach him. Estimated arrival. For days, Shadow had grown dramatically in those 2 weeks. The dragon was now the size of a small house, with wings that could spread 20 feet across. Those wings were Shadow's current obsession. The young dragon spent hours practicing flight, making short jumps that turned into brief glides. Most attempts ended with Shadow tumbling into the dirt and making embarrassed sounds. Daniel found himself coaching the dragon, showing confidence when Shadow hesitated at the edge of high rocks. "You can do it," Daniel would say, even though Shadow could not understand the words. The dragon understood the tone and the belief behind it. Shadow would gather courage and leap. Grandmother watched these lessons with what Daniel swore was amusement. She had begun bringing Daniel food suited for humans. Fruits that were safe to eat, roots that could be cooked, even fish from the distant river. She somehow knew what he needed. The healer dragon visited twice more to check Daniel's arm. It was healing faster than should be possible. The paste she used had properties human medicine could not match. On the 3rd day of waiting for rescue, everything changed. Grandmother began roaring warnings into the sky. She positioned herself over the clearing with her wings spread wide and fire gathering in her throat. The healer dragon appeared with 2 others, all of them taking defensive positions. Shadow pressed close to Daniel, scales bristling with fear and confusion. The young dragon looked to him for guidance. Daniel heard the sound before he saw anything. Engines. Ship engines. But not the deep, steady burn of a rescue vessel. These were quick and maneuverable. Combat ships .3 vessels dropped through the clouds, unmarked and aggressive. They spread out in attack formation, and Daniel's blood went cold. He knew what they were. Poachers. Dragon scales sold for fortunes. Dragon bones could be made into weapons that never dulled. Dragon eggs on the black market could buy entire planets. And here was a mother dragon with a juvenile, isolated on an unmapped world with no protection. The lead ship opened fire on Grandmother. Plasma bolts hammered against her scales, and she roared in fury. She launched herself into the air, moving faster than something her size had any right to move. .2 ships kept her busy with coordinated attacks, while the 3rd landed near the nest. Armed figures emerged wearing powered armor that enhanced their strength and speed. They carried nets and shock weapons designed to bring down large creatures. They saw Shadow and moved toward the young dragon with practiced efficiency. Daniel stepped between them and Shadow. The lead poacher laughed. The sound came through external speakers on his helmet. "Move aside, human. This is not your concern." Daniel had grabbed a weapon from his ship's emergency kit days ago. A small plasma pistol that he had never expected to use. He raised it now with his good hand. The poacher raised his own weapon, something much bigger and more deadly. "Last chance," Shadow roared. The sound was enormous, coming from deep in the young dragon's chest. It was not the chirp of a hatchling anymore. It was the battle cry of something ancient and dangerous. Fire erupted from Shadow's mouth. Real fire, hot enough to melt metal. The blast caught the lead poacher's face shield and turned it into slag. The man screamed and fell backward. The other poachers opened fire. Daniel shot back, his small pistol almost useless against their armor. But he kept firing because stopping meant Shadow would be alone. Shadow fought with everything it had. Claws tore through armor. Teeth found weak points. Fire turned weapons into molten junk. The young dragon was not trained and not experienced, but it fought with pure desperation to protect the human who had become its entire world. Above them, grandmother saw her offspring in danger. She went berserk. She stopped trying to be careful and instead became a force of pure destruction. Her claws tore through one ship's shields through sheer power. She ripped the vessel apart in midair and sent it crashing into the forest. The other two dragons joined the fight. The healer might have been old, but she still had fire and fury. Her companion was younger and fast, darting in to strike at weak points. The poachers had expected an easy hunt. They had not expected organized resistance. They had not expected a human fighting alongside dragons. They had not expected the mother dragon to be this powerful or this angry. More poachers emerged from the ships, trying to overwhelm with numbers. Daniel shot one in the knee joint of his armor, and the man went down. Shadow pounced on another, pinning him under massive claws that a plasma bolt caught Daniel in the shoulder. The pain was instant and terrible. His arm went numb, and he dropped his weapon. He stumbled backward and fell. Shadow screamed. The sound was grief and rage mixed together. The young dragon left the poacher it had pinned and ran to Daniel, placing itself over his body as a living shield. Plasma fire hammered against Shadow's scales. The dragon roared defiance and refused to move. It would die protecting Daniel if that was what it took. Grandmother heard her offspring scream. She abandoned her fight in the sky and dove. She hit the ground between Shadow and the poachers with enough force to crack stone. Her roar shook the entire clearing. The poachers finally understood that they had lost. 2 of their ships were destroyed and half their people were down. The mother dragon was beyond fury and the juvenile would not leave its human. They retreated to their remaining ship and launched, leaving their wounded behind. Grandmother sent a blast of fire after them that scorched their hull. Then she turned to the clearing where Shadow stood over Daniel's motionless body. The young dragon was making sounds she had not heard since the day it hatched. Lost sounds. Frightened sounds. Grandmother approached slowly and touched her snout to her offspring's face. Shadow looked up with eyes that held tears. Daniel lay in the dirt with a plasma burn through his shoulder. His breathing was shallow and his skin had gone pale. Shadow lowered its head and pressed against him, trying to share warmth, trying to help, trying to do anything that might bring back the human who had taught it to fly. The healer dragon landed beside them and shifted to her smaller form. She looked at the wound and made a grave sound. Then she pulled out her clay pot and got to work. Shadow would not move from Daniel's side, even for the healer. The young dragon stayed pressed against him, humming that vibrating sound that was supposed to ease pain, making it louder and more desperate than ever before. Pain woke Daniel. His entire left side felt like it was on fire. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Strong but gentle pressure pushed him back down. Shadow loomed over him, making anxious sounds. The dragon had tears running down its scaled face. Daniel had not known dragons could cry. "Hey," Daniel whispered. His voice came out rough and weak. "I am okay." Shadow made a sound that clearly said you are not okay. The dragon very carefully lowered its head to rest on Daniel's chest, being mindful of the injury. Daniel lifted his good hand and touched Shadow's face. The scales were wet with tears. "I'm sorry I scared you." They were in the cave that grandmother had shown him during storm. The healer dragon sat nearby, grinding plants in a stone bowl. She looked up when Daniel spoke and made a satisfied sound. His shoulder was wrapped in layers of leaves that smelled like the green paste. The pain was bad, but manageable. He had been shot by a plasma weapon and survived. The healer's medicine had probably saved his life. Outside the cave, Daniel could hear activity. He struggled to sit up again, and this time Shadow helped support him, moving with surprising gentleness for something so large. The clearing looked like a battlefield. 2 poacher ships lay in pieces, torn apart by dragon claws. Scorch marks blackened the ground where fire had burned. One of the healer's companions was being tended to, recovering from wounds taken in the fight, and hovering at a careful distance above the trees was another ship. Human design, clean lines, and official markings. His rescue ship had arrived. Daniel's communication device crackled to life. The voice that came through was professional, but clearly concerned. "Daniel Reed, this is Captain Wilson of the transport vessel Bright Horizon. We tracked your beacon and arrived to find what appears to be a recent battle. Are you injured? Do you require immediate medical evacuation? Daniel picked up the communicator with his good hand. Shadow watched him closely, sensing something important was happening. This is Reed. I'm injured but stable. The battle was with poachers. They're gone now. We saw the wreckage. Daniel, we need to extract you, but the dragons make approach dangerous. Can you move away from them so we can bring down a shuttle? Daniel looked at Shadow. The dragon was pressed against his side, watching him with those intelligent golden eyes. Shadow knew something was wrong. The young dragon could sense Daniel's tension. Grandmother appeared at the cave entrance. She looked at Daniel, then at the ship overhead, then back at Daniel. She made a low, rumbling sound. Daniel, the captain's voice came again. We cannot wait indefinitely. If you can move to a clear area away from the dragons, we can extract you within the hour. Shadow whined. The dragon pushed closer to Daniel, making sounds that clearly meant do not leave. That Daniel's mind raced through his options. The rescue ship was here. He could get medical treatment, return to civilization, go back to his job flying cargo between stations. His old life was right there, hovering overhead, waiting for him. But Shadow could not come with him. Dragons could not survive in ship environments long term. They needed space and sky and the earth beneath their feet. Shadow belonged here on this forest moon that if Daniel left, Shadow would try to follow. He knew this absolutely. The dragon would attempt to reach the ship, might even succeed in getting aboard. But it would mean leaving grandmother, leaving the healer, leaving everything that Shadow needed to grow and thrive. If Daniel stayed, he gave up everything. His career, his apartment on Station 7, his friends, his entire world. He would be stranded on an unmapped moon with no infrastructure, no guarantee of survival beyond what the dragons chose to provide. Daniel, we need your decision. We have limited fuel for hovering like this. Shadow pressed its head against Daniel's good shoulder and made a sound so quiet and vulnerable that it broke his heart. The dragon was pleading. Stay. Please stay. Grandmother walked fully into the cave. She approached Daniel and lowered her massive head to his level. She looked into his eyes, and he looked back. She could not speak his language. He could not speak hers. But understanding passed between them anyway. She was offering him a place here. A purpose. A family that had already accepted him when they had no reason to trust a human. She was offering the chance to be part of something no human had ever experienced. But she was also giving him permission to leave. If he chose his own kind, she would understand. She would hold Shadow back and let Daniel go free. It would hurt her offspring, but she would do it if that was what Daniel chose. The choice was entirely his. Daniel picked up the communicator. His hand shook slightly as he pressed the button. Captain Wilson, this is Reed. I'm staying behind. Mark this as a voluntary decision. I'm not under duress, and I'm not being held against my will. Silence on the other end. Then, Daniel, that's insane. You cannot survive alone on an unmapped world. Your injuries need proper medical care. Be reasonable. I'm not alone, Daniel said quietly. He looked at Shadow, at grandmother, at the healer who was watching from her corner. And I'm being completely reasonable. This is my choice. You'll die out there. Maybe, but it'll be my decision. More silence. Then the captain's voice came back. Harder now. I cannot authorize this. You're injured and possibly in shock. We're coming down to extract you. Shadow's head snapped up. The dragon heard the change in the ship's engines as it began to descend. Grandmother roared a warning. The other dragons took flight, positioning themselves between the clearing and the descending ship. They were not attacking, but they were making it clear that landing would not be easy. Captain, if you come down here, people are going to get hurt. The dragons are protecting me because I've chosen to stay. Don't force this. The ship stopped descending. Daniel could imagine the argument happening in the cockpit. Finally, this is against every protocol we have. But if you're certain, if this is truly your choice, I cannot force you to board. It's my choice. Then God help you, Reed. We'll log this and report your position. If you change your mind, if you can get a signal out, we'll come back. Thank you, Captain. The ship began to rise. Shadow and Daniel watched it together. The dragons in the air escorted it back through the atmosphere, making sure it truly left. Shadow turned to Daniel with eyes that showed so much emotion he could barely stand to look. The dragon extended one wing and very carefully draped it over Daniel's shoulders in a gesture of protection and comfort. They sat together in the cave entrance and watched the stars emerge as night fell. Daniel's old life was flying away into those stars. His new life was pressing against his side, warm and alive, and completely devoted to him that he had made his choice. For better or worse, he belonged to the dragons now, and they belonged to him. 3 months passed, and Daniel Reed became someone new. His hair grew long enough to tie back, and his body changed from the soft shape of someone who lived on stations to the lean muscle of someone who survived by strength and will. His shoulder healed with only a small scar, thanks to the healer's medicine that worked better than anything human doctors could provide. Shadow grew even faster. The dragon was now large enough that Daniel could ride on its back, settling between the shoulder blades where natural ridges provided secure handholds. They flew together almost every day, with Shadow growing more confident and skilled with each flight. Grandmother had become Daniel's teacher in ways he never expected. She could not speak his language, but she taught him anyway. She showed him which plants would heal and which would kill. She demonstrated how to read weather in the shape of clouds and the behavior of birds. She led him to a spring where water bubbled up clear and cold from deep in the earth. She brought him to a cave system that would serve better than the temporary shelter he had been using. Daniel spent weeks turning the main cave into something like a home. He built a sleeping platform from wood and woven grasses. He created storage for food and tools. Shadow helped with everything, learning to use fire with precision to shape stone and dry wood. The healer dragon visited often, always checking Daniel's shoulder and bringing new medicines. She seemed pleased with how well he had adapted. Sometimes she would shift to her smaller form and sit with him, both of them watching Shadow practice hunting techniques that Grandmother demonstrated one afternoon. The healer brought 3 other dragons to the clearing. They were younger than Grandmother, but still ancient by human standards. They watched Daniel with clear curiosity. Word had spread among their kind, Daniel realized. Stories were being told about the human who stayed, about the bond that even a mother dragon could not break, about Daniel Reed who chose dragons over his own species. The visiting dragons kept their distance, but they watched everything. They saw how Shadow responded to Daniel's voice. They saw how Grandmother trusted him near the nest. They saw how the healer worked alongside him to treat the injured dragon from the poacher attack. One of the visitors, a dragon with scales like polished copper, made sounds that seemed like questions. Grandmother responded at length. The copper dragon listened, then approached Daniel slowly. It lowered its massive head and looked into his eyes for a long moment. Then it bowed slightly, the same gesture of respect Grandmother had shown weeks ago. Daniel understood. He had been tested and found worthy, not just by one dragon family, but by their wider community. More dragons began visiting the clearing. Some came curious, some came skeptical, but they all left having seen something rare. A human and dragon who had chosen each other completely. Daniel built a larger shelter with Shadow's help. The dragon had learned to control fire well enough to char wood to the exact hardness Daniel needed. They worked together with a coordination that came from deep understanding rather than shared language that on a night when both moons were full, Daniel sat outside his cabin watching the forest. Shadow rested beside him, no longer small enough to curl around his feet, but still insisting on being close. The dragon's head rested near Daniel's shoulder, and one wing draped loosely over his back. Grandmother approached, moving with quiet grace despite her size. She settled nearby and made a rumbling sound. Shadow responded, then looked at Daniel expectantly. "What?" Daniel asked. "What are you two planning?" Grandmother stood and spread her wings. Shadow immediately stood as well, moving into position beside its mother. They both looked at Daniel with clear invitation. "You want me to fly with both of you?" Shadow made an excited sound and lowered itself so Daniel could climb aboard. He settled into his usual spot and checked his grip. Shadow waited until Daniel signaled ready, then launched into the air with powerful strokes of growing wings. Grandmother flew beside them, matching Shadow's pace. Together, they climbed above the canopy and into the open sky where stars blazed in unfamiliar patterns. They flew for hours. Grandmother led them over parts of the forest Daniel had never seen. Waterfalls that fell 1,000 feet in a mist. Valleys where strange creatures grazed in moonlight. Mountains that pierced the clouds. Shadow followed its mother with complete confidence now. The awkward hatchling was gone, replaced by a juvenile dragon that moved through the air with grace and power. Daniel held on and watched the world pass below. This was his world now. These forests, these mountains, these dragons. He had given up everything he knew for this, and sitting on Shadow's back flying through an alien sky, he could not imagine choosing differently. They returned to the clearing as dawn painted the sky in colors that had no names in human languages. Grandmother landed first, Shadow second with barely a bump. Daniel slid down, and Shadow immediately checked him over, making sure the flight had not caused any problems. The dragon was always careful with him, always aware of how fragile humans were compared to dragonkind. More dragons had gathered in the clearing. The healer was there with 5 others. They had been waiting. Grandmother made a sound, and all the dragons responded, creating a chorus that resonated in Daniel's chest. Shadow joined in, voice blending with the others. Daniel stood in the center of the clearing, surrounded by dragons. They were acknowledging something, celebrating something. He did not understand the specifics, but he felt the meaning that he had become part of their community. Not just Shadow's companion, but someone the dragons as a whole had accepted. Shadow came to his side and pressed close. Daniel put his hand on the dragon's neck and felt the strong heartbeat beneath scales. The hatchling had followed him everywhere from the moment it was born. Even its mother could not stop it. And now, 3 months later, Daniel followed Shadow just as completely that he looked at grandmother and she looked back. Understanding passed between them. She had lost a child to this strange bond, but she had gained something too. Someone who would protect and care for her offspring with devotion that matched her own. The sun rose fully and the gathered dragons took flight, returning to wherever they called home. Only grandmother and the healer remained with Daniel and Shadow. Shadow made a happy sound and bounded toward the forest, clearly wanting to show Daniel something it had found. Daniel followed, laughing at the dragon's enthusiasm. Grandmother watched them go. The ancient dragon settled at the edge of the clearing, keeping watch as she had since the day her offspring chose a human over everything else. Some bonds transcend species and reason. Some families are not born, but chosen through trust and love and sacrifice. Daniel had found his family among the stars, not on a space station, but on a forest moon where dragons flew and impossibilities became truth. The dragon hatchling had followed him everywhere. And in the end, he followed back into a life more extraordinary than anything he could have imagined. A life where he belonged to the dragons and they belonged to him, bound together by a bond that even death might not break. This was home now. These were his people. And standing at the edge of the forest, watching Shadow's tail disappear into the trees, Daniel Reed smiled and ran to catch up with his dragon.